Well, good morning. I'm going to hand over to Emma because Emma was the author of this excellent report, and it's probably the most significant report that's been done on the issues of modern slavery in the construction industry to date. The report could have been twice as big as it was, but we had to really slim it down. But I'm pleased to say that what we tried to do in the report was do a bit of name and fame, because I think it's important to recognise where good practice is. For those of you who don't know much about the CIOB, well, we are the professional body for construction management. I've got about 46,000 members in 100 countries across the world, 36,000 of which practice in the UK. And they're at the sharp end of delivering construction. You know, either contracting, consultancy, site management, and what have you. So they actually get to experience a lot of what goes on. And my members are very much behind the work we're doing in trying to deal with and tackle these issues, because I'm very pleased to say they've got a very strong moral compass. And we heard earlier today about the law. Yeah, but sometimes what's legal is not necessarily right. And part of the challenge we've got to do is to try and align the law with the moral compass, and that means shifting the law along. But that's all I'm going to say, but all I would add is that Emma's going to go through some of the key points from the report, and as the author, I think she deserves a recognition for that. So Emma, it's all yours. Can we go now?
Hi, thanks very much, Chris, and thanks to CIOB who've actually supported me for about 4 years in writing these reports. The latest one is called Construction and the Modern Slavery Act. It's our third one, and it was meant to be an afterthought to a previous one we'd done on international supply chains. About 2 years ago, we said, okay, we've kind of looked at that. Shall we have a look at the UK? Because there's this legislation going on. And we were slightly embarrassed at the time to ask the question, because we weren't sure what we were going to find. There wasn't much data, there weren't many case studies. Things weren't really happening at the time. So we decided to hedge our bets a little bit and look at worker standards in the UK as well. And that proved to be very, very interesting, because actually it emerged more and more strongly that general worker standards and the general ways that workers are treated is intrinsically linked to levels of exploitation and indicators of problems. And we realised quite quickly that you can't put modern slavery into a bubble, because there is a whole spectrum of exploitation going on. It might just be a little bit of late payment. It might be being forced to work in unsafe conditions, all the way down to very extreme forms of modern slavery that we've heard about this morning. So we decided to look at that, and we realised that people were also moving in and out of sectors. It was very hard to really understand what was going on in construction. But what we discovered was we sort of looked at the business model, and we thought, how much is our industry at risk? And I think we've sort of covered a lot of this already this morning, but you've got an industry that's really in multiple tiers. Late payment is very much the norm for many companies. There's a massive abuse of the retention system where money is withheld. Typically, you could get 5% of a project fee withheld at various points in the supply chain, because people are then checking quality of work. We know that some of the big players, some of the people at the top of the supply chain are withholding that money because they just want a project discount after the price has been agreed. So there's lots of kind of bad practice that's going on. And this isn't necessarily leading to modern slavery, but it is creating conditions where workers are going to be more vulnerable. We knew from a survey of small builders by the FMB that quite a few were saying they were late in paying their workers occasionally when the money wasn't flowing through to them down the supply chain. And these were British companies who, you know, whose workers would not have considered themselves in any way exploited. Our industry, construction, has the highest insolvency rate of any industry in the UK. So I think that's really worth thinking about how precarious we are financially. Huge numbers of workers on minimum wage. We know there is a lot of work going on in the best practice side of things to improve this. And we know that quite a few companies are now looking at living wage, which is a very, very good step. But nevertheless, this is a big indicator, a very high reliance on migrant workers, a lot of workers from the EU and beyond. I think Romania, Poland, you know better than me, are very big sending countries to our sector. High levels of bogus self-employment, that's in our industry. I think in many industries, it's seen as a bit of a tax dodge for the self-employed, but actually what's happening is workers are being really pushed into quite vulnerable situations where they are not protected, they lose the protections of direct employment. And companies might see this as a sort of an advantage to the way they operate, because obviously they're saving a little bit on tax and holiday pay and all those other things. But it really is turning us into more of a kind of a gig economy, and it is very much eroding rights. We know that unscrupulous labour agencies are taking advantage of this, and we've also written about umbrella companies, which is kind of way of rolling up workers' pay so that the money is flowing down through an even more levels, and more deductions have been taken out of their wages so that they don't actually know what's going on. A lot of workers were saying to their unions that they didn't really understand their wage slips. You know, it's as simple as that, even if they were getting a wage slip. So what we found was this was really leading to an imbalance of power, where really we're not saying all workers are in trouble, but all workers are at some risk of exploitation, especially the ones on site, the ones on lower wages, just because of the structure of the industry. Okay, so what are we going to do about it? I mean, I think you've heard from people like Mark at the GLAA. Obviously, there's lots of work going on here. But in terms of what was going on in our sector, when I started to talk to people about construction, there was a general feeling that it's not really for us. You know, modern slavery is kind of happening in the food sector. We know that. It's happening in India. It's happening in the Gulf. But can it really be happening in the UK? Very, very poor visibility in the supply chains. Contractors really don't see much below tiers 1 and 2. That's what we're hearing. Modern slavery is often coming in at tiers 4 and 5, as we've heard already this morning. And there's a case of how do you look? You know, it's very, very difficult to know how you can drill down. Right to work checks. These are the sort of immigration status checks. A lot of companies thought that they were safe because the government was asking them to do these checks, and they thought that would then detect modern slavery. And of course, a lot of people who we know are in slavery, they could be British, they could be EU citizens, they could very much have a right to work. So that's a kind of a bit of a red herring, but it was seen as a lot of companies as, oh, we're okay. Auditing. We cover quite a lot of the great work of people like the University of Bath, Andy Crane, and his colleagues were looking at how there were systemic auditing failures. In more developing countries, auditing is very vulnerable to all sorts of forms of hard corruption, bribery from various parties. In this country, we're not making such a strong claim, but what we are saying is that if you're outsourcing your auditing to a private company, actually the problems might be detective, but will they be reported to the police? Will they be sent to the modern slavery helpline? That's much more in doubt because they're more worried about saving their own business and saving the reputation of their client. So it's something that really needs to be looked at, and I know people like Professor Crane really are trying to encourage a different way of thinking about auditing, and we'd welcome those kind of developments. A lot of complacency, a lot of denial we've talked about, low regulation. There's not much, because the scrutiny in the construction sector, it was not as big as was covered by the GLAA and things like shellfish, fisheries, food production. There was a feeling that it was easy for criminals to move over into our sector because it was less risk for them. We're finding that criminality, as Justine was saying, keeps evolving. So it was hard for businesses to keep up. They might put in some measures, but they'd quickly be out of date. And large players, this is a structural problem in many areas, not just worker rights, not just work exploitation, but they're shifting the risk down the supply chain onto the SMEs. And when you think that SMEs account for about 92% of the whole industry. That's a really tough thing to do. Also, SMEs are less equipped. They don't have the same resources to be able to do those immigration checks, those right-to-work checks, and the other modern slavery checks that need to happen. We know that checking documents, checking passport documents, it's become an incredibly fine art to really understand how the subtleties and the nuances of the forgeries. They're incredibly sophisticated these days. We heard a story from the food sector where somebody was employing, he didn't realise he was employing Brazilians in his factory. He thought they were Spanish, but the passports were so sophisticated, he didn't know. He only found out through general chat to his teams. Okay, so the challenges ahead. Price still dominates, so you're still getting the major players and the clients. I think the clients, including government departments, need to take responsibility for this, that they really are pricing out a lot of the ethical players because they are really focusing on lowest cost. There's little legal incentive to act. We've heard already about poor levels of MSA reporting. I think in construction, in the first sort of cycle, only about 30% of companies reported at all. I gather from TISC report that number is now slightly better, but I think the quality of the reporting is also big in question, and it's not really reflecting genuine activities that are going on, as Justine was saying earlier. Brexit, we're going to be very vulnerable when EU workers are potentially having to ask for visas. Just the potential of an EU worker having to wait 6 months for paperwork and companies desperate to get new workers in. Obviously, the worker might be tempted to cut corners and the company also might be tempted to cut corners because we are already facing a big skills crisis, as you all know. This could be a real problem. EU accounts for 60% of imports into the sector. So if you're doing due diligence on materials, just think about how that level of disruption might affect your procurement patterns. And also, how do you achieve meaningful transparency? I think that's a question that's going to be answered later this afternoon, hopefully, so we won't dwell too much on that. So CIOB, from these reports, we are now trying to do other things. We're now looking at projects to try and help the industry move in different directions. Our expertise is not really in building materials. We prefer to work collaboratively, and I'd like to thank a lot of people in this room who helped us with the report. It was a very collaborative effort. But we're saying, we've launched a route map to fair business, and today we're tweeting out a video, which you'll see from the CIOB policy Twitter account, but we're saying change the narrative. Let's admit that all supply chains are at risk. CEO buy-in is essential. We've got to raise standards, including looking at living wage and trying to guarantee living wage down the supply chain and actually check that that's happening. We need to collaborate and share intelligence with multidisciplinary groups, and I think work with the GLAA, Modern Slavery Helpline, and all sorts of local trafficking, anti-trafficking networks are springing up, such as in West Yorkshire, and I know in the Midlands, and I think I would really encourage industry to get involved at a local basis as well as a national basis. All businesses should write an MSA statement, I think, as the Welsh Government is encouraging, and that would help them to start thinking. And you need to really start working with suppliers to build trust. Thank you.